Good. Next up, we have Nancy Sweet. Nancy came to me, I can't remember how many years ago. It was a few weeks ago, just a month or so. She came to me and said, I want to do some rose breeding. I said, Nancy, I don't breed roses. Well, you're going to fall right back in. She goes, how can we do rose breeding? I said, we can't, but I have some grape breeding projects you can work on. So it's going to be good. So she's currently working at FPS and actually retired from FPS, right? FPS historian emeritus.
That's the title.
Perfect, I like it. Come on up. Do we, yeah, oh, they're still brewing.
I'm incompetent at this, so.
It's fine.
Oh, there
Oh,
it is.
it's
Okay.
very delayed.
So where's the little, oh, here.
Devices.
Thank you, Andy. My name is Nancy Sweet. I was in Andy's lab from 2003 to 2006. But I met Andy when I was finishing my second baccalaureate degree at UC Davis in 2003. I came back to Davis as a retiree from the judicial system in Sacramento, where I had been working in the legal system. And I decided, after several years of classes in horticulture and also a couple of stints at a estate garden in England, that I was going to pursue landscape gardening using ornamentals. And so I went to study with a rose breeder in Visalia. Carl Lund will remember him. His name was Ralph Moore. Ralph was very generous and taught people how to use his techniques and theories. And he even donated a bunch of his germplasm to us here for Davis. I brought back for Davis to do some breeding. So I decided I would pursue a graduate degree in rose breeding after I finished my undergraduate degree in 2003. And one day I was sitting in the Department of Environmental Horticulture talking to a staff member, and I was bemoaning the fact that there aren't any graduate programs in rose breeding in the United States. And Andy walked in and said, "Roses, I like roses, I'll help you." And I was so excited. I thought, oh my gosh, that's awesome. And so, alas, we didn't get to do it because I didn't have any crosses. And I know, I remember you said, why don't you go to Europe, and make the crosses, go to Europe and come back and then do it. But I didn't have that time. So he said, well, you know, roses, grapes, they're both woody perennials. Why don't you try grapes? And so I thought, oh, great. That's great. I was very excited. And then I begged my way into the lab. I had to beg, but it was great. It was a really cool thing. So I got a master's degree in Andy's lab, and here's my master's thesis, A Long Way from Roses. It was on root angles, and I worked on a population that I believe was originally crossed by Peter Cousins, Ramsey by Riparier-Guar, in '97, and I think, Kristen, did you have some additional crosses on that? Kristen Lowe was another one I worked with, and we were I think they were trying to find a marker for root angles on grape rootstock. So that was that, and I spent an awfully lot of time in the greenhouse measuring angles, root angles on green cuttings, and then we did some more root angles in the field, and I think they pursued it further after I left. You had more groups. I called them the root angle gang, kept coming and asking me questions when I worked at FPS. But it was really good, and I enjoyed it. The lab was big, of course, but that worked out for me quite well later on, because when I would go do all my research at FPS that I had to do to outreach with people in the industry, all I had to say was I was in Andy's lab, and inevitably somebody from the place I was going was also from Andy's lab. So it was really good. I had a really good experience. Oops. Oh, yeah. The most important takeaway for me from the master's program in my future job was Andy's ampelography class. And that was just, it was very entertaining. Of course, he's such an entertaining speaker. I always had a great time in class. But I had kind of a steep learning curve, as you can imagine, because I knew nothing about grapes. And I want to be on record, I didn't try to put yellow sticky notes on the backs of the leaves, even though that probably would have helped a little bit. I see Jeff Wheeler laughing over there because we were in the same class, and the only ones I knew were naked veins on Chardonnay and the shot holes on Cabernet. And those were easy, but the rest of it was a struggle. All the white grapes all looked alike, and it was really hard. But I used those notes that I took in ampelography almost quite often at FPS in the 15 years I worked at FPS. I can't say how many times I got them out and dusted them off and used them. And Andy let us come down and audit again, so I got to audit the class a couple more times. So most of you here know what FPS is, but just in case somebody doesn't, it's a center on campus that usually works with certified material, for sure with Grape certified material. And in the early days, viticulture and plant pathology kind of shared ownership of FPS and managed it. But then in the 90s, this university split it off into an independent plant center. And then it had its own director at that time. FPS also is a USDA importation and quarantine program, does that for the USDA. After I got my degree from Andy's lab, Dr. Deborah Galina was the director at FPS. She was looking for someone who had research and writing skills and also knew something about grapes. And I think she figured that I fit that bill because I'd spent quite a bit of time as an attorney in my attorney years doing research and writing and organizing things. And she thought that would fit well. She was looking for someone to make an online grape database of the FPS Foundation collection and also to document some of the historical sources of our grape selections. So I went over and worked at FPS. Now, Andy has quite a few ties at FPS, I found out as I went there. He always would say, I was the director at FPS, you know. And I would say, oh, what? And I was researching the FPS history at the time. And in the 1990s, when the university was trying to put together the plan to make FPS independent, Cal Qualsit of agronomy was heading the umbrella group that included FPS. He put some crop-specific people into FPS to manage the program, and Andy managed the program, the Grape program there for, was it 2 or 3 years?
6 months.
6 months?
That was enough.
No. Okay, well, should have let me say 2 or 3 years, no. Anyway, he was, in fact, the acting director of the FPS Grape program, so I was able to validate that. Also, what he did, a very important function, our program, the Grape program that FPS works with, requires that all of our vines are professionally identified as true to type. And back in the early days, Dr. Olmo did that, and Curtis Alley, I think, helped him. We had some European people come over, like Jean-Michel Borsico and Anna Schneider. And it was all ampelography back then, before DNA got to be popular. And I think, well, it probably wasn't the time you were acting director, but soon thereafter, Andy took over that function and came every year to make sure that our vines were professionally identified. I tried to find out when you started. I called Bud Dangle, our DNA expert. He said they found a document with your name on it from '94. But I didn't know when you started. But anyway, he did that every year, and he was very generous with his time on that. And of course, Andy's own products are in the FPS Foundation collection. You'll probably hear more about these these varieties later on from some other talks. But one of them was the Grin nematode-resistant rootstocks. The photos are pictures of a press conference in the area that FPS shares with VIT out west of campus. And they were having a press conference with the release. He has such captive, your names are so creative for your products. I thought Grin was good, catchy. Also, the PD-resistant scions have really catchy names. It took me a while to figure it out, but I figured it out. And they've been very popular, been in demand by the areas of the country that have PD pressure. And so those will be discussed later, I think. But personally, Andy was most helpful to me in my work at FPS, and I was there for 15 years after I left Andy's program. And we tried initially to start a online catalog called the National Grape Registry. And Peter Cousins and Andy, I remember meeting with them, and we were trying to figure out how to sort those out for an online catalog. And we had about 800 varieties at FPS, and it was a mess. There were synonyms all over the place, and grapes were called all different names and everything. So we were trying to do that, and those two helped us with that. And that National Grape Registry was moved over to the FPS website now in the grapes section. So all that material, that identification and source information was moved over to the FPS site. Also, what I'm going to talk about now involves what I call a book. It's an online publication, but it's 15 chapters, and I just counted up the Word documents last night, and it's 1,018 pages total. So it took me about 10 years to do it. I think I've interviewed about half the people in the audience for the book, because I recognize a lot of people, a lot of nursery people are here, and there's a big chapter on the nursery people. It's great. Those are the online databases and the newsletter articles that I started out doing. The book is called The Wine Grapes of UC Davis. You'll see down in the lower right-hand corner. It's on the homepage of the FPS website, and that's the URL. We focused on wine grapes because that's what the industry was asking Deborah to do features on, and that's what all of the articles in the newsletters and the research I did was oriented toward. We focused on the commercially successful varieties, and we tried to figure out the history and the stories of where they all came from. Here's the page. When you click on that, you will see that at the top, Wine Grapes of UC Davis. And there's 15 chapters in the book. It's a lot. It was a lot of work. I get tired looking at this index of names, but it starts with the grapes as they came to the university when it started when they were in Berkeley. From 1879 to 1950, talks about it starting in the experiment station, when Bialetti brought them to Davis, when the department moved to Davis eventually, and that's the first chapter, just the first chapter. Harold Olmo is featured as a chapter of his own, and I put it up here because Andy really helped me with that. He let me interview him about Dr. Olmo. I didn't ever know Dr. Olmo, so it was really good to have somebody like Andy help me. And I figured he deserved his own chapter because he brought so many selections from all over the world that were in the FPS collection. He deserved that. And he also, with Dr. Hewitt from Plant Path, were responsible for the beginning of FPS. They worked with the state and the industry to develop the certification program way back in the 40s, and then FPS, in its current form, appeared in the 50s. But he was a very unique man, so he got his own chapter. And then there's 2 chapters on the history of FPS, and those are very detailed chapters. They have lots of records, we displayed as many records as we could that we thought were illustrative and helpful, and it's very detailed, and it goes through last year, 2021, when I retired. And the next 2 chapters are really good chapters, and they just got posted. They're on the history of the nursery industry, and that's the nursery industry that participates in the certification program. And the next chapter is on the profiles of the people who participated. I did as much research as I could on the old ones where there was nobody left to interview, mostly in Napa and Sonoma, places like that. But everybody else was very good and let me interview them, and they spent a lot of time with us. For example, Deborah and I went to interview Rich Cundy, and Jim Pratt was there, and he helped us with make that connection, and we got a lot of comments from him. And Jim, we got many comments from the old timers, and we went down and interviewed Luther, and we interviewed quite a few of the people that are in the industry that have moved around to different nurseries. And so I think it's good. It has lots of stories, and it's long. It's a long chapter, but very good. And then after that are the variety chapters, and those chapters contain usually groups of grapes, where they came from, and the stories of how they got to California or got to the collection. They're usually from California, but not always. And it was really good doing those chapters. I had done previous chapters in the FPS newsletter on maybe one, like Cabernet in 2008, but the Cabernet Sauvignon chapter became the Black Grapes of Bordeaux, and then I gathered up all the other selections or varieties in the FPS collection into one chapter. And it's just, it's been a real treat to do all of these, but it is, anyway, it's called a book. I call it a book. And I have to thank Andy so much. He's quoted in the book all the time, in every chapter. A lot in the Olmo chapter, but a lot in the variety chapters. And he was very good. He answered all my calls and emails, yay! I was so excited because I didn't really have anybody else to ask on this stuff, and I knew he would always have the answer. So anyway, he's quoted a lot, and I appreciate his help. Thank you for letting me hang out in your lab and being patient with me in grapes, and for answering the questions and helping with the variety and helping us with the grapes. I had a very lucky second career. I never thought I would find something as fun and interesting as what I got. It was 15 years worth of good, and I appreciate you for steering me to grapes. Thank you.